Okay, it's time to begin. Everybody find a pew. Check under the pew for your winning ticket. Glad you're here this morning. That's fine. That's fine. Okay, if you're not in your pew, you're marked as tardy now. That's what I tell my students, Okay, we're in Isaiah 33. We're going to try, my goal is to read together with you 33 through 35, so we will get to the Hezekiah narrative, which is what we've been leading up to. Isaiah. Did I say Judges? I may have, who knows? It is early. So I don't know. Yeah, Isaiah 33. This particular chapter is a statement against what's called the destroyer, which, in my understanding, is the Assyrians. The Assyrians, of course, are going to make a move on Jerusalem because they have already come down into the land of Palestine. They've taken over the northern kingdom of Israel. They've also conquered many of the small hamlets and towns in Judah. And, the prize is Jerusalem. And so we have been leading up to Hezekiah and how God has already predicted through Isaiah that the Assyrians are going to be conquered. They're not going to take Jerusalem. So we've been hinting at that all through the Isaiah prophecy after we dealt with King Ahaz and his failure. So what we have is, in Isaiah, we've got two kings that are put side by side. The first king, Ahaz, is a bad king because he did not function from the position of faith. He relied on foreign alliances to, find security and sought outside help for strength against other rising powers that threatened him. Well, God said that's a bad idea because the people that you're trusting in are the people who have breath, which, of course, are human beings, and you're not trusting in God. The whole purpose of Isaiah's prophecy, his book, is to illustrate that people need to trust in God. But sometimes it doesn't seem practical to do that, particularly when you're threatened by outside armies. So the kings always seem to choose the practical, what they think the human wisdom thing to do. If you form an alliance with Egypt or you form an alliance with, other smaller powers, then you as a collective become a strong power against a superpower, the Assyrians. And so that's sort of the idea that we have during Ahaz's reign. But God, through Isaiah, told Ahaz that's not going to work. And, he's going to fail as a king. Now, fortunately, during the Isaiah narrative, early in Isaiah, when we're talking about in Isaiah 7 and 8 and 9, the statements about the king who's going to reign in righteousness and all that, I think is dual prophetic. That is, it's referring immediately to the rise of Hezekiah, who's going to be a totally different king from his father Ahaz. But even Hezekiah is going to fall prey to human weakness because he does open the storehouses to the Babylonians. You know, he's making alliances and things of that nature. Then God comes through Isaiah to say, the people that you revealed everything to, your wealth, are going to be the ones that are going to come and destroy you. And that's where we're heading. So even though we have a mountain peak of faith in Hezekiah compared to his father Ahaz, who was a sorry individual in regard to faith, Hezekiah is going to be one of faith, and he's going to be the one who, because of his faith, spares Jerusalem from being destroyed by Sennacherib from Assyria. That's because he turns to God. When he's given a letter by the general of the Assyrians saying, look, I don't know why you have confidence in your God, because I have destroyed all of these, nations and these cities, and what God is going to keep me from doing the same to you. Well, when he gets that letter, it scares him to death, and he goes to the temple and he lays it out and he prays. And guess who comes to see him? Isaiah. And Isaiah says, oh, don't worry about it. God take care of it. And God did, which was predicted prior to the narrative that we're going to read a little bit later, where God sent his punishing angel, and 180,000 Assyrians were killed, and they all retreated. And the interesting thing from history is that Sennacherib in his annals said that I had Hezekiah caged like a bird. And that's all we have. And he might have had him caged for a particular period of time, but it wasn't but a couple of days when he was assassinated. And, of course, Judah remained. So we have another couple of hundred years that Judah remains. But even though Hezekiah was a good king, and then there's some bad kings, and then we have Josiah as a good king, and then, they just kind of get worse, as it seems that human beings do. Ultimately, 586 BC, we have the Babylonians, Nebuchadnezzar, that comes and takes the southern kingdom of Judah. So they do fall because of their sin and lack of trust. And if they would just learn from Hezekiah and Josiah, they may have continued to survive and be a kingdom. But it wasn't in the cards, so to speak. God knew who they were. God knew what would happen. That's why, beginning in Isaiah, all the way back in Isaiah 7, we talk about Ahaz's son, Shear-Yashub, and Emmanuel, and Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz, and then we have the wonderful counselor, all of those images. Even though I think initially it's pointing to the rise of Hezekiah, who's going to be a righteous king. He will reign in righteousness. His failure, will be the downfall, ultimately, of Judah. But Isaiah's full prophecy, the complete, what we would call what he's really looking toward, is the reign of who? Jesus. It will be Jesus who will be the one that will be the perfect king. Okay? He came to do the will of his Father. That's what God wanted every king to do. You know that kings in Israel and Judah are referred to, they were considered sons of God, because God was the father of the king. Jesus is the ultimate Son of God. We even have the, what would you say, the coronation of the king. Hebrews 1, and I think Isaiah 9 is the coronation of the king. He sits down and he's recognized as the king. So Jesus becomes king after his death and resurrection to reign. But even though Isaiah is ultimately looking at King Jesus being the perfect king, and why he's called the Messianic prophet, because there's so many statements and prophecies in Isaiah that the New Testament writers refer to and record, you have to understand that there's also an immediate application of what Isaiah is writing. All the chapters that are leading up to the Hezekiah narrative are warnings to Hezekiah, who's the new king. Ahaz has died. Hezekiah's the new king. So God goes around and condemns all the nations around Judah, okay, saying they're all going to be judged by him and destroyed by him. So the logical conclusion is, Hezekiah, don't form alliances with these kings, because they will not be your salvation. And so when Isaiah's telling all of this, and we have it recorded, this is a warning for Hezekiah to operate from a position of faith, both in life and politically. Okay? So we're still in that section where we have Isaiah, you could almost say speaking in earshot of Hezekiah. We have the collection of his oracles, and I think the oracles were sermons that are preached at different times that have been gathered together, okay, to form the book of Isaiah. It's Isaiah's message. Isaiah wrote it, but these are like sermons, prophetic utterances that are in the earshot of people who are leaders in Judah, in Jerusalem. Now remember, there's a thread that runs all through this. Even though punishment comes, there's a righteous seed, a remnant, okay? And it's going to be talked about. It is the remnant that's going to be saved. They will be preserved. Even though they have to go through hard times, they're going to experience, a lot of difficult times. But when judgment is talked about, deliverance is the opposite. And so it's like, you have two sides of a coin. You have God's judgment, and then he talks about deliverance, salvation. So it's not one-sided. It seems like that, but you'll notice in these difficult condemnations of the nations, interspersed within them are statements of hope for the righteous seed. What's the righteous seed? Who are the righteous seed? Who are the remnant? They're the ones who trust in who? God. And so that's the issue that Isaiah is raising and wanting Ahaz to know. Don't commit the folly of your father. So, chapter 33. We have the judgment that is spoken against the Assyrians. God used the Assyrians as his destroyer, didn't he? Yeah. He used them as an instrument of punishment for sin. Well, when he gets through with using them to punish his people, what does he do? He then turns and he punishes them for their sin. God is sovereign, right? And so it's not like the Assyrians, the great power, are in the clear. And although they're conquering nations, and God is allowing them to do this in order to purify the nation of Israel, he will put a halt to it, which he does, when they try to take Jerusalem. And God says, I'm going to deliver and defend my holy city. And he does. So, this is a message to the Assyrians, who are the destroyers. Okay? He says, "Woe to you, O destroyer! While you were not destroyed, and he who is treacherous, while others did not deal treacherously with him, as soon as you finish destroying, you will be" what? Destroyed. As soon as you cease to deal treacherously, others will deal treacherously with you. This is interesting because when Sennacherib retreats and goes home, he's assassinated. And then there's vyings of power and struggle. And then, of course, the Babylonians are rising up in power, and they take advantage of the situation, and they become the world power. So here Isaiah, and this is interesting, Isaiah is predicting all of this before it even happens. And he has done that on several occasions. You remember he stated earlier that the Assyrians will come to the neck of Judah, indicating they'll come very close to the head, Jerusalem, and God would put his foot on it and say, "That's it, that's it." And that's exactly what happens. They never make it into Jerusalem, though they're very close. God stops them. So this is just a reiteration and warning to the destroyer. And I suppose the Assyrians, and Isaiah is a prophet to the nations. The Assyrians ought to be listening to this. But it's for the benefit of Hezekiah. Let God take care of them. Vengeance is mine, what? I will repay. So this is an example in history where God is going to be doing that against the Assyrians. Verse 2, "O Lord, be gracious to us. We have waited on you." Here's Isaiah's words. This is Isaiah. "O Lord, see, we have waited on you. Be their strength every morning, our salvation also in the time of distress. At the sound of the tumult, peoples flee, and the lifting up of yourself, nations disperse. Your spoil is gathered as the caterpillar gathers, and locusts rushing about men rush about on it. The Lord is exalted, for he dwells on high. He has filled Zion with justice and righteousness." This is a foreshadowing of Hezekiah's reign. What does Hezekiah do? He initially runs the nation in justice and righteousness. Now he's not as strong as we wish he would be, so there needs to come a perfect king who is perfect in righteousness and perfect in justice. Jesus, we know that. But don't assume that there's no immediate application to what's happening here. So he says, a sound of tumult, peoples flee, so forth. Verse 5, "The Lord is exalted, for he dwells on high, and he's filled Zion with justice and righteousness. He will be the stability of your times. A wealth of salvation, wisdom, knowledge. The fear of the Lord is his treasure." What's the treasure of the people? What's the greatest treasure? "Lay not up for yourselves treasures on" what? Earth. Right. The treasure is our trust and faith in God. That's the greatest treasure you can have, because it guides you in the way of God and righteousness and justice. It is that which will preserve you. It is that which blesses you. And so here's Isaiah's call, talking about the treasure. A wealth of salvation, wisdom, knowledge, the fear of the Lord is his treasure. Look at verse 7. "Behold, their brave men cry in the streets, the ambassadors of peace weep bitterly. The highways are desolate, the traveler has ceased. He has broken the covenant, he has despised the cities, he has no regard for man. The land mourns and pines away, Lebanon is shamed and withers, Sharon is like a desert plain." you need to know some geography of Bible to appreciate all that. The Lebanon, the high, where the trees come from, all the beauty of Lebanon up north, and then you have the plains of Shiloh. It's fertile in the land of Palestine. Well, who has affected all that? The Assyrians have, right? They've come in, they've conquered Samaria, and all of those hamlets and towns, even from up north and come down the Fertile Crescent where they are, and they came down. So there's a lot of devastation that has occurred by the Assyrians. Continue reading. He says, verse 9, the land mourns and pines away. We have Bashan and Carmel lose their foliage. Now I will arise. This is Isaiah, God using Isaiah's words. Who's going to arise? Now, God's going to arise. When God arises, it's cosmic. Okay? Just as I said last time, anything that God does is used in cosmic language. Okay? When God arises, the earth what? Trembles, shakes. When God stretches out his hands, the stars flee. Everything is always cosmic, has cosmic figures whenever God does anything. Even if God is only doing something to a little area on earth, Judah, Jerusalem, it's still cosmic because God is acting, right? Because he's the sovereign God of heaven and earth. How else can you describe God except in that kind of language? So you continue. He says, now I will arise, says the Lord. Now I will exalt. Now I will be lifted up. You have conceived. I love this. You have to love the prophets. They are sarcastic to the enemies of God. I mean, really, sarcasm is great in the prophets. If you want to learn how to be sarcastic, you need to read a lot of the prophets. Memorize a lot of the language there. Because sarcasm works with evil people. It makes the point. It's a way of saying things that gets attention, that's based on truth. And notice what he says. He says, you have conceived chaff. You will give birth to stubble. You got to find that funny. It's just like I said, I know it's Sunday morning, and it's hard to get the blood going and, David has an advantage on Wednesday night because everybody's awake, right? And everybody's talkative and into it. Sunday morning, it's kind of like we're kind of waiting for something. If this doesn't wake you up a little bit, and this is funny stuff. This is worth memorizing and saying it to somebody. So you've conceived chaff, and you're going to give birth to stubble. My breath will consume you like fire. You see the imagery there? If that is the depiction of God's enemies and evil, just chaff and stubble, and God is fire, what chances do the enemies have against God or the fire? Nothing. They're consumed. I mean, it's not even contemplated. Well, stubble has a chance. I mean, I think it's 80-20, maybe. No, they're going to be totally wiped out, right? He says, the people will be burned to lime like cut thorns which are burned in the fire. You who are far away, hear what I have done, and you who are near, acknowledge my might. This is where I believe when the prophets spoke, they not only spoke to God's people, they spoke to the nations. They're preachers to the nations. Israel was to be a light to what? The nations, to the world. They were to be the model, the example of what life of faith is. And they were to influence the nations, but they failed to do that. Why? Because instead of influencing the nations, they allowed the nations to influence them. They became idolaters. Even during Josiah's day, they were worshiping idols. And Josiah had to go along, and they didn't have the book of the law. They found it, as David, you remember, talked about. And so Josiah started knocking down all the altars to the idols and burning up the little figurines of gods and goddesses. Why was that in the land of Israel? Well, it'd be like, why is a Playboy magazine in a Christian home? Why are certain websites viewed by Christians? Why are things done in secret? Is that not the same thing? Absolutely it is. And so it's a matter of choosing righteousness and choosing to trust in God. So sinners in Zion are terrified. Trembling has seized the godless. Who among us can live without consuming fire? Always pay attention to the rhetorical questions in the prophetic utterances, because the answer is going to be given, and the answer is obvious. Who's going to survive? Who among us can live with continual burning? Now think about this. This is a message that judgment is going to come to the destroyer. The destroyer has done a lot of things, and a lot of innocent people of faith, have been hurt. They've experienced some of this. But notice what it said. He who walks righteously and speaks with sincerity, he who rejects unjust gain and shakes his hand so that they hold no bribe, he who stops his ear from hearing about bloodshed and shuts his eyes from looking upon evil, he will dwell where? On the heights. What's on the heights? Isn't that where Jerusalem is? Mount Zion? Metaphorically, ultimately, with God in heaven. That's the one that will survive. Those are the ones who will persevere through the carnage, through the heartaches, through what's happening. Sometimes innocent people, what? Suffer? That's what always the argument against God. Why does God allow the innocent to suffer? Well, because sin's in the world. Duh. I don't get the argument. It's almost, does God spare me from everything in this world? Or is it because sin is in the world that sometimes the unfortunate lifestyles and judgments and decisions of people impact me? Right? All right. The government raises taxes. The righteous are going to have to do what? Pay more taxes. Well, I thought I was innocent in it. I didn't vote for that. You're going to have to pay more taxes. And if you don't, then you might get in trouble, right? Well, yeah, absolutely. So that argument to me philosophically doesn't make sense, because even the unbeliever doesn't truly believe it on the premise. Because if there is no consequence concerning actions, and I don't suffer because of the unfortunate choices of others, they denied the universal idea of what life is about. They've created in their philosophy nothing but selfish brats. Think about it. You do whatever you want to do. No one says no. Things happen over here, but it never happens to you. It's almost like a 2-year-old, right? Who, who's no punishment, there's no consequences, there's nothing. And then all of a sudden, that little child begins to make demands. This is not fair. It's selfish being a brat. That's what the philosophy ultimately leads to. All right, let's take away this idea of suffering and consequences of things. Let's let an athlete never exercise or lift weights. Is that going to be effective? That would be nice if you didn't have to go through the grueling pain of, getting in shape. That's one of the reasons why I always hesitate to start up again, because I know the first 2 or 3 days I'm going to be so sore I can't walk. So let's, you got to bust through that to keep going. What I'm saying is the argument doesn't make sense. It's an emotional argument because no one likes to suffer. So if God is all loving, all kind, why do I suffer? See, it's an emotional argument, but it's not logical. These people have suffered. The righteous seed has suffered. The righteous seed even went into Babylonian captivity, didn't they? But God restored them, right? So there is deliverance. There's hope. That's why we maintain our hope in Christ despite what happens to us. My illness, tragedy, crisis, tornadoes, hurricanes, whatever, death, I have the hope of eternal life. So, this is what's being addressed here. It says, verse 17, your eyes will see the king in his beauty. They will behold a far distant land. Your heart will meditate on Terah. Where is he who counts? Where is he who weighs? Where is he who counts the towers? You will no longer see a fierce people, a people of unintelligible speech, which no one comprehends, of a stammering tongue, which no one understands. Foreign nation coming, speaks a different language. What do the ancient kings love to do? That's one thing they love to do. And you can see it in archaeology. What do they love to do? Build monuments to themselves, and that monument will say, we captured da-da-da-da-da, and they'll have drawings. They'll have chariots, and they'll have all the enemies, being, underfoot. They'll have ropes or whatever, and they'll have it through the nose of their victims, and they're carrying them around. And they count all the battles. We defeated, Mi'kmaq. We've defeated Lachish. We defeated, all these different people, these nations. Even some of the kings of Israel are mentioned in these reliefs, these annals of kings. That's what they love to do. There was a king in Israel that did that. First king, Saul, built a monument for himself. That's what he wanted to do. To be like the other kings. See, that's not operating from faith. Who do you want to build a monument to? Yourself? Or do you want to glorify God? I think that's an important question. But we fall into sin so easily that way. So here, Isaiah is saying, all these people are counting the towers, all the defeats, all the nations we have whipped and destroyed, and they're coming, and we don't understand them, their language, these foreigners. He says, verse 20, look up, Zion, the city of the appointed feast. Your eyes will see Jerusalem, an undisturbed habitation. How can Jerusalem be an undisturbed habitation when every city and hamlet and village around them has been decimated? You see the prediction that Isaiah is making? And it's going to happen with Hezekiah, because Hezekiah has a different spirit than of his father Ahaz. Ahaz put Jerusalem in jeopardy because of his lack of faith. his son, Hezekiah, which, by the way, says that a son can overcome the sins of his father. Okay? The son had a different spirit, and when crisis came, he didn't turn to Egypt. He didn't turn to anybody. He got frightened, but he went into the temple. Isn't that what God wants us to do? Exactly. So, we have, look at Jerusalem. It's untouched. A tent which will not be folded. Its stakes will never be pulled up. Of course, this is conditional based upon what? The faith of the people, the faith of the leader. When God says things like that, they're conditional upon the people. And, you know, from 722 to 586, this is how long Judah remained. Faith drives the tent pegs deep, and you don't see the tent taken up and folded up. Okay? The imagery may not be so impactful with us, but it is very impactful to those who were the original recipients. Okay? So, he says, but there the majestic one, the Lord, will be what? Do you hear Emmanuel? The Lord will be for us. What does the word Emmanuel mean? God is with us. The Lord will be with us. A place of rivers and wide canals on which no boat with oars will go, on which no mighty ship will pass. This is reference to enemy ships who are going to come, the Mediterranean, and then hit inland, usually in where Joppa is, which is, what's the modern city now? What is it? Come on, y'all gotta help me. It's the big city in Israel. No, what? Yeah, Tel Aviv. That's it. Thank you. That's where the planes fly in. Tel Aviv, you go a short distance, you have Joppa. Tel Aviv's modern Joppa. But then next to Joppa, you have the old Joppa. You can see how it's grown. But anyway, Tel Aviv was what I was thinking of. All right. I had Kiev on my mind, or Kiev, however people want to say it. For the Lord is our judge, verse 22, for the Lord is our lawgiver, the Lord is our king, he will save us. Your tackle hangs slack, it cannot hold the base of the mast firmly, nor spread out the sail. Then the prey of an abundant spoil will be divided, the lame will take the plunder. Okay, don't read quickly through these prophetic statements. Does this make sense? Who takes the plunder? The victors, right? Not the lame. See, when the Assyrians leave, what do they leave? No, they leave their spoils. They leave everything. They rush back to their homeland. Who gets all of that? Well, see, the imagery is that it's opposite. You wouldn't expect the lame and the weak to enjoy the spoils, which is what the opposite is. You would expect a mighty nation to get the spoils of the weak, Israel, right? Jerusalem. But it's going to be opposite. It's sort of like what we did in not Kuwait, Afghanistan, when we left what? All. Do you realize what all we left militarily? Have you seen the pictures of the jeeps, the planes, the helicopters, the ammunition? Can you believe that? It's like the lame getting the spoils. He says, verse 24, and no resident will say, I am sick, for the people who dwell there will be forgiven of their what? Okay. What is truly sickness? It's not physical sickness. True sickness from God is sin, unforgiven sin. That's what you'll be sick no more. Now, you can have a person who is terminally ill, who obeys the gospel. From heaven's perspective, they're sick no more. Now, they may die, right? Because they're physically ill. God didn't promise that they'll be cured, but they are sick no more. That's the point. That's where people, I think, get confused. That if I become a child of God or whatever, then I develop an immunity, an earthly immunity to sickness and crises and things of that nature. No, the point that we have is in faith, you see, we defeat our most formidable enemy. That's the most important thing, sin. We have the hope of eternal life. We can be in fellowship with God. That's Isaiah's message. Draw near, O nations, chapter 34, nations, to hear and listen, O people. Let the earth and all it contains hear, and the word and all the springs from it. For the Lord's indignation is against all the nations, and his wrath against all their armies. Again, this is a reiteration of judgment against the nation in earshot of Hezekiah, who's the new king. Don't form alliances and trust in kings, foreign kings, who are human. Trust God. Evidently, he needs this message a lot, like we need to hear the message a lot too, right? He says, for the Lord's indignation is against all the nations, his wrath. He has utterly destroyed them. So their slain will be thrown out, and their corpses will give off their stench, and the mountains will be drenched with their blood, and all the host of heaven will wear away, and the sky will roll up like a scroll, and their hosts will also wither away as leaf withers from a vine. You'll hear this kind of language in the book of Revelation and other sections in the Bible, like Matthew 24, when you're encountering cosmic things like the destruction of Jerusalem. The book of Revelation dealing with powers where Christians are suffering. And so you have this apocalyptic language. Why apocalyptic language? Because it's the language of the cosmos. God's acting. And it's always bizarre. How do mountains clap their hands? How do the mountains melt? God gets up and things melt. You know, the closest thing I remember is the Indiana Jones, you know, when they looked in the box, you know, and all of a sudden, guy's face started melting, you know. That was freaky. But that's the issue. When God acts, it is cosmic. And so that's how the prophets talk about it. Now, one more quick thing, and I'll be finished. When the prophets prophesy, it's usually in what we call the perfect tense in Hebrew, which means it's already done in the mind of God. So it's talked about in past tense, even though it hadn't happened yet. That happens with prophets concerning God's actions. It's a done deal. If that's true, what about his promises? It's a done deal, right? No matter what happens, it's a done deal. So, thank you.